So it's bonus sermon time. As we move through some sections of the Bible, I'm just going to have way too much to preach than I can get out in one sermon. And rather than giving you a 3-hour sermon, I thought I'll just do a few of these bonus sermons. And Judges is an area where I just have a lot of interest, and I've done a lot of work. And so I thought for at least the period of time we're in Judges, I'll do some bonus sermons. Tonight's bonus sermon, Women in Judges. Because there are actually a lot of women in Judges, and I think there's a lot to be learned from noticing the overall trajectory of the stories involving women as they develop through the book. So what we're going to do for the next few minutes, which may be more than a few depending on how fast I talk, I'm going to quickly summarize every single story in the book of Judges that has a woman in it. This is a quantity over quality lesson. We're going to hit all of them really quick. But what I want you to notice is not the individual stories, I may come back and preach on those later, but the trend of how women are viewed, treated, and described in these stories. Start in chapter 1. First woman in the book of Judges is Aqsa. Aqsa is the daughter of Caleb, and Caleb is attempting to marry off his daughter in verses 11 through 12. And what he decides is if anybody would go and conquer the region of the Negeb down to the south of Judah, then he will also not only get the region of Negeb, but also get my daughter Aqsa to be a wife. And so Othniel, who we later find is the first judge, does go down, he captures the land, and he comes and he claims Aqsa. Okay, give me your daughter, she's going to be my wife now. That's verse 13. Aqsa, however, is not up for that. She's fine with the whole marriage arrangement. That was pretty typical in the ancient world. But she feels like her husband is getting fleeced. The Negeb is a desert, right? And so you are using me as a tool to get someone to go conquer something and then giving him the land you don't want anyway, and me. And so she rides up on her donkey to Caleb. Remember, this is Caleb, the great hero of the book of Joshua, one of them. His daughter rides up, hops down off the donkey, and essentially shakes her fist at him and says, yeah, it's not going to happen. You're going to throw in land with water too. And Caleb, who's of course a great patriarchal figure and is going to have his way, no, he just completely rolls over and says, whatever you want. And he ends up giving Othniel and Aqsa, actually, both the Negeb and the regions of northern and southern waters that were attached to it so they could water their herds and so forth, all because she went and demanded it. Okay, so this is a short, simple story. What's the point? Aqsa is depicted as a strong woman. She has a name, she has a voice, she goes and she makes demands, and Caleb says, yes, of course, dear. The name Aqsa actually comes from a word that means anklet or bangle, like a piece of jewelry. Only when you use it as a verb in Hebrew, it means a shaken bangle or anklet, as if a woman has a piece of jewelry on and she's shaking her fist. That sound, which many men know to be terrifying, is her name, right? She is a woman who will plant her feet and shake her fist at you, and that is her name, Aqsa. So a very strong woman is the first woman figure in the book of Judges. Second would be Deborah. Deborah is another enormously powerful figure. Deborah is described as a prophetess. She speaks with authority from God to the people, and she's not really doing it quietly. Throughout later in the book of Judges, women are introduced through their husbands. So example, Manoah's wife is only known to us as Manoah's wife, right? But when Deborah is introduced, it's Deborah, a prophetess, the wife of Lapidoth. Like, this isn't Lapidoth's wife, this is Deborah's husband, right? That he is the secondary figure in this story. He never comes up again, completely irrelevant. I don't know what he's doing with his life, but Deborah is the main story. And the text describes her as one that the people of Israel came up to her for judgment. She sits under a tree, and people come to her to hear her render a verdict from God on the issues of the day. She is the mother of Israel, and she's an enormously influential figure. She summons Barak to her, as we studied in this morning's sermon, And Barak, he refuses to go to battle without Deborah. That's the only way he's going to go. And then at the end, she and Barak lead the people in a song of celebration. So again, she's an outspoken figure. She has a name. She has a relationship to the people all on her own. Her husband's barely in the picture. Outspoken, wonderful figure. Okay. At the end of that story, we get the very brief story of Jael. Don't know a lot about her, except that Deborah had promised Barak that the Lord will sell Sisera into the hand of a woman. And instead of a great heroic battle where Barak slays his enemy, it's Jael who slays the feared general Sisera with a tent spike through his head, which makes for, as we saw this morning, a wonderful Sunday morning topic of discussion, very graphic. So story so far, just quickly recap. In the early stories in Judges, strong women, women with names, and I know it sounds like a silly thing, don't all women have names? Just pay attention and notice when in the story, in the text, a woman is given a name as opposed to when she's not. And it often kind of indicates something. Is she a person in her own right in this story? If she has a name, she probably is. If she doesn't have a name, she's just being treated as a side figure, and that's kind of fascinating. The early women in Judges all have names. Deborah, Jael, Aqsa. And they all have lines. Not Jael, tent stake is her line. But they all have things to say, and it records their dialogue specifically in the story. Now, you get a transition in the middle stories of Judges. There's no women to speak of in the stories of Gideon or Abimelech. They just kind of disappear. But then when you get to the later stories, women come up again, and they're in every story after that, but not in the same way they were early on. The first woman we notice in this kind of third section of the book is someone we simply know as Jephthah's daughter. You know what Jephthah's daughter's name is? Jephthah's daughter. Right? I mean, that's just how we know her. Jephthah is a bit of a scoundrel. He's running around with bandits and outlaws out east of Jordan. And in a time of danger, the people go and say, "Would you lead our forces and deliver us from this oppressor?" He says, "Yeah, sure." He's a little pagan in his thinking, and so he kind of bargains with God. He says, "I'll make a vow. If you give me the victory, when I come home, the first thing that comes out of my house, I'll offer that to the Lord." I'll probably have a lesson just on Jephthah later, because there's a little ambiguity in that part of the story. But what is clear is that when he returns home, his daughter comes out to greet him and is the first thing that he sees. His only child, a daughter. And he makes an arrangement with her where she's able to mourn and grieve for a couple of months, but then the text kind of ambiguously but also clearly in verse 39 said he did with her according to his vow that he made. Which is frightening. I mean, did he offer her as a sacrifice? Is that what happened? So compared to Aqsa, this daughter who is strong and vocal and goes to her father and says, "Here's what I want," you have Jephthah's daughter, unnamed. She does have a couple of lines, but mostly it's just very submissive, and she doesn't really have any say in it. Her father made a deal with God, and so she goes along with it, accepts it, and then disappears from history in that way. A very tragic story in Judges chapter 11. There's at least three, women in the life of Samson that's interesting. First is Samsons Mother. Again, what is Samson's mother's name? Samsons Mother, or as the text says in Judges 13, Manoah's wife. She has lots of lines. She's important to the story, but she's never given a name. The angel appears to her and tells her that she's going to have a son and the significance of this son, kind of in the same way an angel appears to Mary in the New Testament. However, when Mary goes to Manoah and says, "Hey, listen to what the angel said," Manoah says, "I'm really not going to buy it until I hear it for myself," which is actually also what Joseph says in the New Testament. And so the angel appears again, not to Manoah, but again to the woman, Manoah's wife. And so she, realizing this is her opportunity, runs and gets her husband Manoah and brings him back, and then he gets to quiz the angel. And he says to the angel, "Are you the fellow who showed up to my wife earlier today?" And he says, yeah. And then he repeats and says, basically, all that I have said to the woman is what you should do. The angel, in a sense, is, I don't want to read too much into it. It's almost as if he's a little irritated that he has to repeat himself. I said this to her, why didn't you listen? So Samson's mother is this interesting figure where God is speaking to her and giving her instruction, but the men in the story are like, well, I'm not convinced yet. When in fact, that was exactly what was going to happen. Samson gets married in Judges chapter 14. His wife's name is one of the daughters of the Philistines. Right? She has no name. It's just a woman that Samson fancies. Samson is a bit of the nice way to say it is ladies' man. The more accurate way is womanizer. He likes the way that she looks. That's what he tells his parents. I like the look of her. She's appealing to my eyes. I want you to go get her. They think this is a terrible idea. She's a Philistine. He says, no, it's what I want. Spoiled brat. Samson demands this of his parents. The Philistines aren't thrilled with Samson for a lot of reasons. And so they appeal isn't the right word, they threaten Samson's wife with death. We will burn you alive if you don't help us to undermine and embarrass Samson. He had given them a riddle. They didn't know the answer. Strange story all on its own right. We'll cover some other lesson. So the Philistines threaten Samson's wife as a way to get at Samson. They take the conflict they have with him and they take it to her and use her as a pawn to undermine and embarrass Samson. Samson has given them a riddle. They don't know the answer. Weird story in its own right. But now Samson's wife is going to be used to undermine him under penalty of death. Right? She's not doing this because she's a treacherous woman. We're going to kill you if you don't. After it's over, she does exactly that, and Samson abandons her. He leaves and goes back to his family's household in Judea or in Israel, and the father of the bride, thinking that she's been abandoned, then gives her in marriage to another man. Tragic story gets worse. Samson then decides he wants her back, because again, Samson is a child who just from moment to moment decides what he wants. So he returns to her, but the father turns him away and says, you abandoned her. I gave her in marriage to somebody else. Samson has a bit of a hissy fit. When we talk about Samson, we'll talk about how the Lord uses Samson's childishness to accomplish his ends. But for our purposes, Samson has a little bit of a fit and burns some Philistine fields with foxes. It's a fascinating story. The Philistines are, again, unhappy about this. But they can't touch Samson. He's too strong. Instead, they burn his wife and her father out of spite. So she's threatened in the first place, do this or we'll burn you. She betrays her husband against her wishes, is forsaken by her husband, given away to another man, and then gets put to death for doing the thing she was doing to avoid getting put to death. She has no power in this story. Entirely manipulated by other people and never really has a voice in it. The more notable woman in the story of Samson is Delilah. Now she does get a name. She's not the next woman, but she is the more well-known one. The next woman mentioned in the text is actually a prostitute to reinforce the idea that Samson is a moral train wreck. In verse 1 of chapter 16, he goes and finds a prostitute. And then, having gone down that road, he finds Delilah. Now, I don't know if we're supposed to read too much into that, of what kind of person Delilah is. You go from wife to prostitute to Delilah. But anyway, that's where he ends up. He's completely infatuated with her, falls for her in verse 4. And then we get a repeat of the previous story. The Philistines go to Delilah and say, you must help us and find the source of Samson's strength so that we can overcome him. I don't think I'm reading too much into the story to assume that there was a threat attached. They had already murdered one woman and threatened her with murder before they murdered her to help them overcome Samson. So I'm just assuming then that that's what happens here. We sometimes think of Delilah as this wicked temptress. She might not have been a good person, don't get me wrong, but there's every reason to believe she was manipulated and pressured into this the same way that Samson's wife had been. She ends up betraying Samson, in verse 19, and then we don't know how her story ends. She just kind of disappears, and leads us to wonder how that plays out for her. I wish those were the last stories of women in the book of Judges, but they actually do get worse. We get no judges and all evil at the end of the book of Judges. Judges 19 tells the story of a traveler, a Levite, and he goes to a city which would later become the city of Jerusalem. So catch the irony in this. A Levite in the city that would be Jerusalem. And this is how the story plays out. He is staying with someone overnight, using their hospitality as travelers often would in the ancient world, and a mob of what are called worthless fellows, worthless men, show up at the front door and threaten and make lewd and awful demands of the housekeeper and of his guests. The Levite solves the problem by taking his concubine, a hired woman, and throwing her out the door. It says he seized her and threw her out the front door to the mob. And the text says that she is raped throughout the night and left for dead. That's what verse 25 says. Verse 27, you get this pitiable, tragic image that early in the morning she crawls and falls on the threshold of the front door and just lays there until someone comes in the morning. I wish that were the end of the story, but it's not. In the morning, the Levite comes to the front door and, without any hint of sympathy, says, "Get up, let us be going." He threw this woman outside. She was raped and left for dead. And apparently, she is dead. But his response is, "Get up, let's go." The Levite throws her corpse over a donkey and takes her home. Think again about the contrast of Aqsa at the beginning of the story, hopping down off her donkey with something to say, and then this mute, murdered woman with no name, thrown up on a donkey and taken home. I wish that were the end of the story, but it's not. The Levite feels like he's been wronged, which makes you want to slap him because the person that's wronged is on the donkey. But the Levite feels like he's been morally affronted. And so, like any normal man does, he dismembers her corpse and sends pieces of her body to the tribes of Israel. And the text says, even in the ancient world, no one had ever heard of that particular job. That was unspeakably strange and evil, and people say, what is going on? So they call a council, and the tribes say, yeah, we have to do something about this. The people of Benjamin, whom they blame for this little mess, they've gone too far. And so the tribes of Israel vow, we'll never give our daughters in marriage to the tribe of Benjamin, because they don't know how to treat women. Yeah, good decision. Civil war ensues. They go to war against the tribe of Benjamin. 11 on 1, you can guess how that ends. They almost eradicate and exterminate the entire tribe of Benjamin. There's a few of them left, a few hundred men that are encamped and surrounded. And at that point, the tribe said, hey, we're about to exterminate an entire tribe. And that's not the way this is supposed to work. That doesn't sound like the kind of thing God wants from us. So how do we now salvage this mess we've made and help the tribe of Benjamin rebuild? I really wish that was where the story ended, but there's one more chapter. The solution they come up with is that we have to find some brides for the men of Benjamin so they can have children to rebuild their tribe. But all of us swore an oath to God that we would never give our daughters to those awful woman-hating Benjamites. What's the solution? It's a simple solution. Kidnapping. We're going to go down the road to somebody who didn't swear that vow, and we're going to kill the men of Jabesh Gilead and kidnap 400 young women, and then give them to the tribe of Benjamin. Because that's probably what God wants, right? It's interesting. God has a lot to say through the book of Judges, absolutely silent in chapter 21. He has no comment. They're just guessing. It sounds like what God wants. And they go do ridiculous stuff. They take the women down to the tribe of Benjamin, and the tribe of Benjamin says, hey, 400 women, really not enough. We're going to need some more. So we go back to some head scratching and trying to decide, how are we going to help the tribe of Benjamin rebuild itself? Great plan. They tell the men of Benjamin, these are the same ones they went to war with because of how they treated this woman. They say, hey, every year at the time of the feast, a lot of women go to Shiloh to worship God. You should go kidnap them. The last story of the book of Judges is about kidnapping women on the way to worship. And the text says, and everyone did what was right in their own eyes. And that's the end of the story. It's terrifying. So think about what we saw in the overall trajectory of the book of Judges. I think there is a trend that you have to notice. I don't think God puts these horrifying stories in the Bible just to sell more Bibles. I don't think that's what it is. Not just to upset us and make us not want to eat dinner later. I think intentionally God put these remarkable women at the beginning, no women in the middle, and then these terribly treated women at the end to give you an image of something you should notice. The early stories have strong women, women with names, women with voices, women who have something to say. The end of the story, the later stories, have victimized women, nameless women, silent women. And what I take away from that is a society's treatment of women is a reflection of its moral standing before God. I don't know personally how to solve or to respond to all the gender issues in the world today or what to do about them. I've got lots of opinions, and obviously all mine are right, yours are wrong. But more likely, that's not the case. But what I do know is that it's not an unimportant topic. When you read the book of Judges, how women are treated in the story tells you a lot about the moral decline of the entire nation. How you treat people that you're able to get away with mistreating says a lot about who you are before God. And I think that's a story, kind of a meta-narrative on top of the individual stories of Judges that we shouldn't allow ourselves to miss. So give some thought to that, consider it, think about the women in your life and how you treat them, think about how we as a church and a society respond to and act around women. Think about other people that may feel powerless in our culture. And we should ask, what does how we treat them say about our moral standing before God? It's an uncomfortable question, and I don't have any answers to it, but it's worth asking.